This didn't happen to me, but my parents saw a Dogman in Illinois about 20 years ago. Me and my parents, late at night, driving back from dropping me off at college, get into a big argument, refuse to talk to each other. Driving down Route 71, get into a little town called Newark, have to slow down. As soon as they get past the dealership, they start speeding up. Get past one of those Little Creek highway bridges, still not up to speed. Suddenly, out of the left side, northwest towards the river, a Dogman appears out of the mist. It hobbles across the highway like Quasimodo, arms held up to its chest, doing some kind of strange zoomer dance, facing towards them, and stares at them as it shuffles sideways, trying to get out of the way. Looks my dad in the eye, says he felt extreme pity and misery. Has glowing green eyes, giant pointed up wolf ears, ugliest thing you've ever seen. Also evil looking, huge fangs sticking out of its mouth, humped back, giant claws, tapered body, muscular arms, giant muscular thighs, hocks like a dog, dirty and filthy looking, no clothes, about 6 feet tall, crosses the highway in a matter of a couple seconds, vanishes into a mist on the other side of the road where there's cornfields, just like what it came out of. Parents continue to refuse to talk to each other for 30 minutes, get into another town, feel safe enough to break the silence, ask each other, did you see that? Both spooked afterwards, refuse to tell anyone what they saw for fear of ridicule. Make me and my brother promise not to tell anyone, and then tell us the story. I'm highly skeptical. They told me it basically was exactly like a werewolf on 2 legs. Exhaust all theories. Escaped exotic animal, monkey, rabbit bear, man in a suit, giant raccoon. Both said for sure it was nothing like that. Tell my parents there has to be a logical explanation. There's no such thing as werewolves. Fast forward 15 years. After almost never talking about it, parents still reluctant to talk about it. It comes up again, so I Google Illinois werewolf sightings. Find out about this thing called the Beast of Bray Road. Start reading more. First time I ever hear of a Dogman. Parents never hear of that. Not into paranormal. And just called it a werewolf. Tell them what I learned. Tell them I'm sorry for doubting them. They still are afraid to talk about it. I saw a weird furry while drunk and high out in the woods in West Virginia. I know I already mentioned this in the title, but I can't really overstate it. I was drunk when this happened. 3 sheets to the wind, 5 ways to Sunday, whatever expression you want to use. Plastered, baked, hammered, shit-faced, stoned, smashed, sloshed, and absolutely befuddled when it happened. More so than I normally am on a weekend, which is saying something. I drank 32 Miller Lights that night, along with half a full bottle of Jack and several swigs of strawberry Smirnoff. I also smoked a non-inconsequential amount of weed. So I'm just trying to say, don't just take the story with a pinch of salt. Treat it like a frozen road. Anyways, I was out at my buddy's out in the woods, and there were about 50 people still there when it happened. There had been a couple hundred there earlier, but it was getting to be around 2 a.m. and most had dipped off a bit ago. The fire was low and me and my buddies were all huddled around the remnants. All of us too lazy to go get more wood. All of us too cold to be anywhere else. It had rained on us during the party earlier, and though no one had cared when it happened, even in July, it still gets cold when you're wet after dark. I remember there were little groups scattered around huddled and talking by the little burn barrels. Hunter had set up secondary bonfires for the party. We didn't know everyone who had showed up, but as most of the people we didn't know had brought groups of single chicks with them, none of us minded. I remember sitting there all but completely out of it next to the fire, my damp t-shirt doing little to keep the shivers at bay. Some story was being told by someone about some teacher from back in high school who allegedly shit himself in class, and it was beginning to turn my stomach, so I reached for another Miller out of the box to water down my stomach and hopefully warm me a bit. My dear reader, this was a mistake. You see, regardless of how cold I felt, at that moment, the beer was actually quite warm, having been out of the fridge for 8 hours and next to a fire for at least 2. I chugged it too fast to spit it out, and it came up foaming and gagged in my throat as my friends laughed at me, running toward the porta potty on Hunter's property at the far end of the field. I would have just gone for the wood line, but around Hunter's property, there's a bunch of rusty wiring that's hard to watch even in the light, and in any case, I didn't want any of my friends recording my dumbass for Instagram. So I took off toward the lone stall, and quickly to my dismay, realized there was actually a line. Not a long one, mind you. As far as I can tell, there were only ever 2 people in that line, and as I was bearing down on the place, a chick walked out of the toilet, letting the first person in. I didn't see her face in the dark, but I do remember her walking fast away from the John. In retrospect, I wish I could have been able to point her out to my buddies, maybe ask her some things. At any rate, I was able to make it to the John and swallow back the vomit for a bit, only to realize the dude in front of me was wearing some kind of animal costume. It did seem strange to me, but people do wear costumes to rave sometimes. I think it was a wolf though. I never really got a full look at it. From the front, all I can say confidently about it was it stank, like he hadn't washed the thing in 3 weeks. In fact, in some ways it stank worse than that. It smelled a bit like dead deer carcass, though I don't want to oversell it. If it really had smelled that god awful, I imagine I would have said something else than what I managed to slur through as I full palm tapped him on the shoulder. "Hey man, any chance I could go first?" is what I got out, I'm pretty sure. He never turned. Instead, his back did this weird whip-like contortion, and then it arched up like a cat. He got on all fours, or rather put his 2 arms on either side of the stall, and then just scurried up the fucking thing. I don't know really where he put his feet or how the hell he did it, but he somehow got on top of the porta potty. From his vantage point up there above, he looked down at me with his weird werewolf Halloween mask, and for a moment, it looked like a tongue came out between the jaws. If whoever was in the stall noticed any of this, they didn't seem to care, as not a sound came from the inside. But between the booze and the scare and the 1,000 superstitious thoughts going through my head as the thing breathed at me, I threw up on the grass and passed out. When my friends came to find me with flashlights, I was lying in my own vomit and couldn't be made to move my arm, let alone stand. They cursed me as they carried me back to the truck, mud and puke getting on them as well. They laid me in the bed rather than letting me sit inside the cabin and took me back to my place, where they took off my shirt and laid me down on the couch. I have no goddamn idea what that was. Honestly, none. No fucking idea at all. But I will say, it did make me think of this. This was about 23 years ago, and I had no clue what a dogman was, and I didn't believe in anything supernatural back then. I was hunting wild dogs in one of the southernmost areas of the Great Dismal Swamp. This is far south of the wildlife refuge, where it ends at the Albemarle Sound in eastern North Carolina. I'd put my boat in the water at a friend's house about half hour by water from where I went to the swamp at. This was in late November, so it was pretty cold and really overcast, and it gets dark around 5 or so. It was about noon when I tied up and got out of the boat. First hour or so was pretty uneventful. I was working my way inland. Some of this part of the swamp can be walked through. When the tide is low, it's just marshy with deeper canals and bogs scattered about, but there aren't any trails or marked paths or anything, so you really have to pay attention where you're going, and definitely need a compass since you can't see the sun. It's pretty dark in there, even on bright and sunny days. I was back in there about 2 hours looking for signs of hogs. I could tell some had been there at some point, but it had been a while. I got a little further in and started smelling what I had thought was a boar. It's rutting season and male wild hogs have a distinct smell. It's musky and a kind of fermented smell mixed with old poo and urine. Kinda hard to explain if you'd never smelled it before. However, this was different. It was musky, but more like an outside dog that's soaking wet. I stopped to look and listen, and after 10 or so minutes, I started to hear a snuffling, breathing that came and went. After a bit, I started to hear some growling. I started to get freaked out because it didn't sound like a hog and it sounded big. I stopped going and knelt down and waited and looked around. Where I was at the brush was pretty thick, so I really couldn't see more than 20 or so feet in any direction. That's when I started seeing movement. It definitely wasn't moving like a hog. It was kinda low, walking crouched down but not on all fours, and I was only getting glimpses of it and it would stop. It was about 40 feet away. This is when I actually started getting scared. I was born in northeastern Kentucky and spent most of my free time as a kid in the woods, camping, riding dirt bikes, and have always been comfortable, even deep in the woods. So when I moved to North Carolina, I fell in love with the swamp. This is the first time I think I had ever felt real and actual fear. I had a Mossberg 590 shotgun, full 3-inch 00 buckshot, with no extra shells and no pistol. The 590 also has a bayonet lug, so I took out the bayonet and put it on. I started backing up, not taking my eyes off of where I last seen whatever it was. A few minutes later, I hear it again, a little further over to my left. I'm about 3/4 of a mile into the swamp wick, doesn't seem very far, but that terrain doesn't make for really quick movement. This goes on for about another 20 minutes while backtracking now as fast as I can, and I'm still hearing it and catching glimpses of movement, and the smell is getting stronger. After a bit, I realize that this thing has gotten between me and the way I came in from my boat, and I'm starting to panic. I try starting to get further away from it and headed in the right direction, and then I see it again, and it's standing up, and it's pretty damn tall. I was still back in the brush, so I couldn't really make out any details as it's dark as hell back there. I wanted to cry and run, but I knew that was bad, and it didn't seem like it wanted to get in the water, so I started wading through the canal, heading back towards my boat. I started to put some distance between it and myself, so I got back on the ground and moved a little faster, but I can still hear it snuffling and growling and moving through the brush, but it's not close anymore. I made it back to my boat and I'm soaking wet and freezing, but I thank God I made it out, and just in time as it's getting foggy and starting to drizzle. I'd never been that scared in my life. I made it back to my buddy's house and told him what happened, and I can tell he knows something when I tell him where I went. He brings me in and gives me some hot coffee with a big slug of bourbon in it. When I calm down, he takes me to the other house out back of his property to where his granddad lives. I met his granddad before, but he had always been kinda standoffish to me. I found out later he just had real bad PTSD from Korea. My buddy and his family had lived in the area since after the Civil War. I think his granddad's great-granddad had been a slave around there, but that's a story for another time. I guess what I mean to say is his family has history in the area and knew the place a lot better than me. After I told his granddad what happened, he stood up, looked me in the eye, and said, "Don't go back in there. You're lucky you made it out. That's where the big dogs live." I left and went home and slept for about 18 hours. I tried to forget about the experience and started to believe I was seeing shit and freaked myself out. I eventually forgot all about it until a few years ago, when a Dogman Encounters video came up in my YouTube feed. I was curious what the hell a Dogman was, so I started listening to it, and the whole experience came flooding back to mind. It was very similar to what happened to me. I started looking into it, and there have been other sightings and encounters in eastern North Carolina. So that's my story. I'm 44 now and still live in coastal North Carolina, but haven't been back anywhere close to that area. I still hunt and love the outdoors and the swamp, but don't go too far in anymore. Friend finally gets a car when he was 17. Bit nervous, so asked me to go out with him one day. Say sure. Arrived at a fairly remote but still close enough place one afternoon. Stopped for a bit to talk some shit. Quiet place by a cemetery. We're sort of positioned above it, like the cemetery's on lower ground and the entrance is higher up. Peer into cemetery. Is that someone digging a grave by hand? They still do that? I thought they use those mini diggers now. Whatever he's doing, he has no regard for the earth he's removing. Bit of a bumpkin play, so I wouldn't be surprised if they were digging by hand. Decent distance away, so it's hard to really tell. Peer harder. I'm not sure that's a person. Encourage friend to drive closer to get a better look. It's a dog of some kind digging the shit out of that grave, like when dogs dig holes on the beach. Pig related, but imagine it more aggressively, digging as if it had a real purpose. Look around, it's done it to several of them. Stops digging and looks right at us, growling. Kinda semi-stands up on its hind legs like a person, but it's still hunched over. Shows no kind of struggling to balance, as if it's done this shit on a daily basis. Takes a couple steps towards us still on its hind legs. Friend panics, pulls a Yui, gets us the fuck out of Dodge. Never been back. We don't have werewolf or dogman stories, or nothing like that where I'm from, but that definitely wasn't an ordinary dog. It wasn't man-sized exactly, not even St. Bernard size. It was more like a really big German Shepherd. Really big in comparison to the size of a regular German Shepherd, but more gray and black rather than all black or black and tan like they usually are. I got one that sort of fits the bill, not pasta though. Live in Farmington, New Mexico for about a decade as a chillin'. This is bordering on the Navajo Nation. Lots of drunk Indians wandering about. Some of our family friends are Navajo, superstitious but didn't like sharing it with outsiders. Run cross country in high school because I'm scrawny, and there's nothing else to do in Farmington besides meth and football. Go to meet in Gallup. This is near Widow Rock, Pick related, which is big to Navajos because it was their capital once. Big in their mythology, part of their creation. Anyways, going to and from the meet requires traveling a long-ass unlit 2-lane highway through the Navajo lands in a shitty school bus from the 70s. with 20 other high schoolers. We're heading back at night and have been like an hour. Pitch black out, near no moon, bumfuck nowhere. Trying to listen to music when the bus lurches. Look at what the fuck our driver/coach is doing. Notice something in the headlights. Looks like a coyote or something, but 8 feet tall. Standing on 2 legs. Running at 60 miles an hour, bobbing in and out of the headlights. 2 of our Mexicans are saying the Lord's Prayer in Spanish. Look down, try to avoid looking and sort of joining in on the praying. Buses maxing out, pedal to the metal. Look up after 2 minutes of this thing going on as it is. See it directly to our left, keeping pace, running up and down a small hill. Looks at the bus. Swear to Jesus it made eye contact with me. Bright, green, inhuman eyes catch the moon, like a dog's eyes in a camera flash. Blood turns to ice. It stands on a small hill watching the bus and gets back down on 4 legs. Get back to town, tell my dad. He tells us our Navajo friend's father comes over and burns sage, spreading the ashes around our home. Never mention it at school to anybody.